Imagine someone throwing a lavish, incredibly expensive party, like the absolute event of the century.
Right.
You've got blindingly bright lights, an astonishing amount of energy being consumed, just a seemingly endless flow of unprecedented wealth. But when the night ends, the host doesn't clean up.
Yeah, they just leave.
Exactly. Instead, all the garbage, the toxic industrial waste, the broken glass, it all gets permanently dumped directly into your living room.
Mhm.
And to finalize the arrangement, the bill for the long-term damages is mailed directly to your descendants.
Yeah.
You never even receive an invitation to this party, but your home is fundamentally altered and your family is left holding an eternal tab.
It is a really stark image. And the thing is, when we apply it to the historical record, it ceases to be a metaphor.
Yeah.
It's the literal physical reality for the communities living on the front lines of the United States mid-century energy and nuclear booms. I mean, we are talking about the physical remnants of the Cold War and the Southwest's electrical grid.
Right. Which brings us to today. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to examine an incredibly complex, heavily documented era.
Yes, it's a lot of material.
It is. We are looking at how the United States Cold War nuclear arsenal, along with its sprawling mid-century energy grid, relied fundamentally on resource extraction from native lands. Specifically, we're focusing on the Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe.
And we should let you know up front, because we're dealing with real illness, death, and ongoing harm to living communities. We are setting aside our usual breezy style today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're taking a very measured, sober approach here.
Right. And the dossier driving our analysis today, it pulls from decades of federal agency reports. We're talking the EPA, the Department of Justice, the Government Accountability Office, the Department of Energy.
Plus congressional statutes, legal consent decrees, and historical analyses of the Colorado Plateau.
And, the central thesis that emerges when you cross-reference those thousands of pages, it's not a narrative of cartoonish villains twirling their mustaches.
Right, you don't find a memo that says, let's go poison this specific group of people.
Exactly. No. What you find is a story of structural reality. The extreme environmental and human costs borne by these communities, they were the result of a very specific architecture of power.
Let's define what that architecture looks like on the ground, because we are talking about geography, right?
Very much so.
It's that physical distance from the centers of federal decision-making in Washington, D.C., combined with just an absolute maze of overlapping federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions.
Yeah, and that geographical and legal distance, it's compounded by unequal bargaining power. When you map those factors together, native land became, structurally speaking, the path of least resistance.
The cheapest place to put the mess.
Exactly. The cheapest place in the domestic United States to externalize the true long-term costs of building a nuclear arsenal and powering modern cities.
That brings us back to the party analogy. It's this concept of an externality made physical. Because in economics, we usually talk about externalities as abstract concepts, like global carbon emissions resulting from a local factory.
Right, something diffuse.
But in the dossier we are looking at today, the externality is totally tangible. It is millions of tons of radioactive rock. It is contaminated water. It's lung disease.
Yeah.
And to understand how that living room started filling up with waste, we really have to go back to the 1940s and the dawn of the Cold War.
The timeline is critical here. So the Manhattan Project proved that a nuclear weapon could be built. But as the geopolitical reality shifted into the Cold War of the Soviet Union, the U.S. realized it needed an entirely new scale of infrastructure.
They needed an actual arsenal.
Right. And building an arsenal requires an astronomical amount of uranium. So in 1946, Congress passes the Atomic Energy Act, which creates the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC.
Okay.
And this is key. From 1946 until 1971, the AEC was the sole legal purchaser of uranium in the United States.
I want to stop on that point because it completely breaks our standard understanding of a free market.
It does.
The government wasn't just regulating a market, they were literally the only legal customer. They held a complete monopsony.
Yeah, they basically created a guaranteed market out of thin air. The AEC issued this document, Circular Number 5, which guaranteed a minimum price for high-grade uranium ore.
Plus bonuses, right?
Exactly. Bonuses for initial production, allowances for haulage. They were effectively writing a blank check to anyone who could pull this material out of the ground.
Wow.
And this sparked a massive prospecting rush across the western U.S., rivaling the gold rushes of the 19th century.
Geologically speaking, the Colorado Plateau, which covers parts of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, It happened to contain some of the richest uranium deposits in the world.
Yeah.
And a massive portion of that plateau sits directly under the Navajo Nation. So the federal government creates this artificial, highly lucrative market. Mining companies, prospectors, wildcatters, they all just flood the region. But I want to ask about the reality on the ground. What does the actual extraction look like for the Navajo families living right on top of these deposits? Because the guys securing the government contracts aren't necessarily the ones swinging the pickaxes in the dark.
No, not at all. And the physical reality of the extraction was incredibly rudimentary. We are not talking about the massive, highly mechanized, heavily regulated corporate mining operations that you might picture today.
Right.
For many Navajo men, the work took place in what became known as dog hole mines.
Dog hole mines. I mean, that sounds exactly as grim as the reports indicate.
It was. These were small, unregulated adits, just blasted and dug directly into the sides of mesas and canyon walls.
Just holes in the rock.
Literally. Often, a small crew of men would just follow a vein of ore into the rock, creating this confined, narrow tunnel. And, we really had to place this in its economic context.
Yeah, why were they taking these jobs?
Right. In the 1940s and 50s, the Navajo Nation was undergoing a severe economic transition. Earlier federal policies, specifically these devastating livestock reduction programs in the 1930s, they had largely destroyed the traditional Navajo pastoral economy.
So the traditional ways of supporting a family were just gone.
Exactly. There were very few industries on the reservation.
Yeah.
The people desperately needed wage work to survive.
So you have a population forced out of their traditional agrarian economy, and they're suddenly presented with this booming, federally backed industry right in their backyard.
Yeah.
The men went underground because they needed to fit their families. But the conditions detailed in these federal health reports are staggering. Walk me through the mechanics of the exposure in one of these dog hole mines.
Well, when you blast and drill into sandstone to extract uranium ore, you generate immense amounts of dust.
Right, just breathing in rock dust.
Yes, but the dust is only the visible hazard. Uranium naturally decays into radium, and radium decays into a gas called radon-222. In an open environment, radon disperses. But in a confined dog hole mine with zero mechanical ventilation, which was the standard for these early operations, that gas accumulates to massive, massive concentrations.
And breathing in radon gas is where the biological damage occurs. But it isn't just the gas itself, is it? It's what the gas turns into once it is inside your lungs.
That is the core of the biological mechanism, yeah. Radon gas decays quickly into what are known as radon daughters, or radon decay products.
Right.
These are solid, highly radioactive isotopes, specifically polonium, lead, and bismuth.
So they turn from gas to solid while inside the lung.
Exactly. When a miner inhales the air in that unventilated tunnel, they are breathing in these microscopic, solid radioactive particles, which then lodge deep in the tissues of the lungs.
Oh, wow.
And once lodged there, they undergo alpha decay. They fire off alpha particles, which are essentially atomic bullets that just repeatedly bombard the surrounding lung tissue.
Causing mutation?
Right, causing severe cellular mutations that eventually manifest as lung cancer, pulmonary fibrosis, and other severe respiratory diseases.
This brings us to a massive legal and ethical failure documented in our sources because, the concept of an invisible, odorless gas causing cancer decades later, it sounds like this tragic, unforeseen consequence of a new technology.
Yeah.
But the historical record makes it devastatingly clear that this was not a mystery.
It was not a mystery at all. The link between confined uranium mining and severe lung disease had been documented for centuries in Europe.
Centuries?
Yes. The Joachimsthal and Schneeberg mines in the ore mountains of Europe had a notorious history of miners dying from what they historically called miner's disease.
Right.
By the 1920s and 30s, European medical studies had conclusively linked this disease to the radioactive decay of radon.
So the science was settled well before the U.S. boom.
Completely. The federal officials at the AEC and the leadership of the mining companies, they were fully aware of this medical literature when they sparked the Colorado Plateau boom.
So the government is the sole purchaser. They know the lethal risks of the extraction process. Why didn't they simply write ventilation requirements into the procurement contracts?
You'd think they would.
Right. Just say, if you want our money, you have to ventilate the mine.
Well, the prevailing argument from the AEC at the time was that they were merely a procurement agency. They said they were not a regulatory body responsible for occupational safety.
Passing the buck.
Exactly. They deferred to the states, and the states were painfully slow to implement or enforce any safety standards on the remote reservation. The result was a profound failure of informed consent.
The miners were simply not told what they were breathing.
The hazard was never communicated. There were no warning signs in English, let alone translated into the Navajo language.
Wow.
And you have to realize the cultural concept of radiation, this idea of an invisible force that could kill you 20 years after you left the mine, it didn't exist in the local lexicon.
How could it?
Right. So these men were subjected to a known lethal occupational hazard without ever being given the agency to weigh that risk against the wages they were earning.
It is the ultimate deprivation of choice. You cannot make a rational economic decision to protect your family if one side of the ledger is intentionally hidden from you.
Precisely.
And the consequences of that missing information were catastrophic. We see it in the epidemiological data, right? This massive spike in lung cancer among populations that traditionally had incredibly low rates of the disease.
Yeah, the rate skyrocketed.
But the physical externality of this boom, the radioactive material itself, it didn't stay confined to those dog hole tunnels, did it?
No, it didn't. The hazard followed the workers home. And to understand how, we have to look at the domestic environment on the reservation at the time.
Okay.
Industrially produced building materials like lumber, concrete, brick, they were scarce and highly expensive because of how remote these communities were.
That makes sense.
So when families needed to build a home, a foundation, or a sheep corral, they utilized the materials that were readily available in their immediate landscape.
And what was readily available were thousands of tons of mine waste rock, the tailings.
Exactly. See, the mining process extracts the highest grade ore, but it leaves behind massive piles of low-grade rock that is still highly radioactive.
And they just left it there.
Completely unsecured, just scattered across the mesas. So families gathered this rock and used it as aggregate for concrete, or they stacked it to build the walls of their homes.
Oh my God.
They essentially constructed living spaces out of material that was actively emitting radon gas.
So the contamination became entirely domestic. The externality wasn't just in the workplace, it was literally in the walls of the kitchen.
Yeah.
And it extended to the hydrology as well, right?
It did. The unlined, unregulated mine sites interacted with the local groundwater and surface water. On the Navajo Nation, many families relied on local, unregulated wells and natural springs for drinking water and for watering their livestock.
And the contamination reached the water.
Yes. Heavy metals and radioactive isotopes leached from the waste rock directly into these water sources.
We must pause here, though, to ensure we are representing the history impartially, as the documents demand. Because we are discussing horrific health impacts, but the economic reality of the time presents a really complex picture.
It does.
This boom brought real money to a place that had almost none.
It is an unavoidable fact of the historical record. The uranium boom provided a massive influx of cash. It brought wage labor and it brought tribal revenue through royalties and leases.
Right.
The tribal government, which was trying to build infrastructure and provide basic services for a rapidly growing population, they saw resource extraction as a viable path to economic development.
Which is completely understandable.
Exactly. Many tribal members supported the work because the immediate alternative was deep structural poverty.
And the agonizing reality is that a family looking at an empty dinner table doesn't have the luxury of worrying about a statistical probability of lung cancer 20 years in the future. They have to survive Tuesday. This perfectly illustrates your point about unequal bargaining power. When the options are abject poverty or working in an unventilated radioactive tunnel, that is not a free market choice.
No, it is coercion by circumstance.
Yeah.
And that structural lens allows us to see how an entire community was boxed into accepting a lethal hazard as a standard condition of employment.
Right.
And while the underground mining resulted in a slow, invisible accumulation of harm within the bodies of the miners, the broader industrial process eventually led to acute, highly visible physical disasters.
Which brings us to this transition from slow, localized harm to a massive infrastructure failure. We're moving to the summer of 1979.
Yes.
We need to examine what happens to the uranium after it leaves the dog hole mine, because you can't just put raw sandstone into a nuclear reactor or a bomb. It has to be processed.
Right. The raw ore is transported to a facility called a uranium mill. And a mill is basically a massive industrial chemical plant.
Okay.
The ore is crushed, ground into a fine powder, and then subjected to a process called acid leaching.
Acid leaching.
Yeah, they flood the crushed rock with immense quantities of sulfuric acid and other chemical solvents to basically dissolve the uranium out of the host rock.
Wow.
Through a series of chemical separations, they eventually precipitate out a concentrated uranium oxide powder, commonly known as yellow cake.
Right, yellow cake. But the yellow cake only makes up a tiny fraction of the original rock. If you process 100 tons of ore, you might only get a few hundred pounds of yellow cake.
Exactly.
So what happens to the other 99 tons of crushed rock and the millions of gallons of sulfuric acid used to process it?
That byproduct is known as uranium mill tailings. It is an acidic, highly radioactive sludge containing heavy metals, thorium, radium, all the other decay products.
And what did they do with it?
The standard industry practice was to pump this toxic slurry into massive containment ponds located right next to the mill.
Ponds. But these ponds are not small, engineered steel tanks. They are essentially artificial lakes held back by earthen dams. And that brings us to the United Nuclear Corporation, or UNC, which operated a massive uranium mill near Church Rock, New Mexico.
Right.
On the morning of July 16, 1979, the earthen dam holding back the UNC tailings pond failed. Walk us through the mechanics of that failure.
So the dam at Church Rock was constructed primarily of soil and clay. Over time, differential settlement occurred.
What does that mean exactly?
It means parts of the dam settled into the earth faster than others, creating immense internal stress. So small cracks began to form in the clay core.
Okay.
Now remember what is in that pond. It isn't just water. It is highly acidic tailings fluid. As the acidic fluid seeped into those small cracks, it actively dissolved the clay structure from the inside out.
The containment structure was literally being eaten by the waste it was designed to contain.
Precisely. And at approximately 5:00 a.m. on July 16, the structural integrity completely gave way. A massive breach opened in the dam.
And the numbers documenting the ensuing flood are just almost difficult to process.
They really are.
The records show approximately 94 million gallons of acidic radioactive tailings solution, along with 1,100 tons of solid radioactive sludge violently poured out of the containment pond.
Yeah, 94 million gallons. To visualize that, you're talking about draining dozens of commercial oil supertankers directly into the desert landscape.
My God, where did all of that waste go?
The torrent funneled directly into Pipeline Arroyo, which is a dry wash that feeds straight into the Porco River.
Okay.
And the Porco River is a major tributary in the region, and crucially, it was heavily utilized by the local Navajo communities.
So it wasn't just some industrial zone.
No, not at all. It wasn't an isolated drainage canal. It was where families watered their sheep and cattle. It was a source of water for agriculture. It was an environment where children played.
And this flood of acid and radiation just swept downstream.
Yes, leaving a toxic residue all along the riverbanks. Elevated levels of radiation were detected in the water and sediment dozens of miles downstream all the way into Arizona.
It is an environmental catastrophe of the highest order. 94 million gallons of radioactive acid spilled into a civilian water supply. Yet, if we look at the national consciousness, like if you ask almost anyone about the largest nuclear disaster in the history of the United States, they don't say Church Rock.
No, they don't.
They say 3 Mile Island.
The contrast in national memory is profound. By the most critical scientific metric, which is the total amount of radioactivity released into the outside environment, the Church Rock spill released exponentially more radiation than the accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station.
Wow.
Church Rock is the largest accidental release of radioactive material in U.S. history,
Right.
period.
And the timeline makes the disparity in memory even more glaring.
Right.
Because the partial meltdown at 3 Mile Island happened in March of 1979.
Right.
The dam failure at Church Rock happened 4 months later, in July of 1979. They occurred in the exact same cultural and political climate.
They did. And the divergence in how the two events were treated by the media and the federal government, it's basically a textbook study in the structural distance from political power.
How so?
Well, when 3 Mile Island happened, it occurred near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
Right.
It was a looming threat to major, densely populated East Coast cities. The people potentially affected were deeply connected to the media hubs in New York and the political hubs in Washington, D.C.
And the national panic was instantaneous. I mean, the evening news anchors were broadcasting live from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Hollywood had literally just released the movie The China Syndrome, which primed the public to be terrified of a nuclear meltdown. And the federal response involved immediate sweeping congressional hearings and a total overhaul of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's oversight of civilian power plants.
Exactly. Now contrast that with Church Rock. The spill occurred in a remote, sparsely populated stretch of northwestern New Mexico.
Yeah.
The primary victims were Navajo families speaking a different language, living on a reservation with incredibly limited political representation in Washington.
They didn't have lobbyists.
They did not have high-priced lobbying firms. They did not have a direct line to network news producers.
So the largest radioactive release in American history, an event that directly poisoned a water supply utilized by living people, was treated as a regional industrial accident.
Yes.
It barely registered on the national radar.
The disparity is a direct reflection of who held political power in 1979. An accident threatening East Coast suburbs is a national crisis. An accident devastating a remote Native community is a footnote.
This highlights a crucial question, though, because when a disaster of this scale happens, regardless of media coverage, you expect the law to function.
Right, you'd assume so.
You expect a robust legal framework to descend upon the polluter, force a massive cleanup, and compensate the victims. The EPA and the DOJ exist precisely for this reason.
That is the assumption. But our dossier reveals that the legal scaffolding built around the Colorado Plateau extraction era functions less like a sword of justice and more like a jurisdictional maze.
A maze.
Yeah, and the primary function of this maze, whether designed intentionally or operating through bureaucratic inertia, has been to shift the massive long-term cost of the cleanup away from the private companies that profited and onto the public ledger.
Let's dissect this legal maze, because there are three distinct federal frameworks we need to understand here.
Okay.
The first deals with the millions of tons of waste generated by the mills, like the one at Church Rock. This is governed by UMTRCA.
Right, UMTRCA.
Yeah.
That stands for the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act.
Mm-hmm.
Congress passed it in 1978, ironically just a year before the Church Rock spill.
Wow.
And the legislation was essentially an acknowledgement that private industry had simply abandoned massive piles of radioactive sand all over the western United States. Under UMTRCA, the federal government assumed the responsibility of stabilizing and securing these abandoned mill sites.
But what does stabilization actually mean in an engineering context? Because you can't incinerate radiation. You can't neutralize a half-life of tens of thousands of years.
No, you can only contain it. So UMTRCA mandated the creation of engineered disposal cells across the Navajo Nation and its borders in places like Shiprock, New Mexico, Tuba City, Arizona, Mexican Hat, Utah, and Monument Valley. The government essentially built massive permanent tombs.
Tombs?
Yes. They consolidated the radioactive tailings, laid down thick barriers of compacted clay to trap the radon gas, added layers of soil to prevent water infiltration, and capped the entire structure with heavy rock riprap to prevent wind and water erosion.
They built artificial mountains of toxic waste.
Basically.
But the engineering is only half the story. The legal and administrative reality of UMTRCA requires something that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novel.
It really does.
Because these disposal cells contain materials that will remain lethal for millennia, the Department of Energy had to create a specific entity to watch them.
Right. The DOE created the Office of Legacy Management. Their mandate is to monitor, maintain, and secure these sites in perpetuity.
In perpetuity. I want to linger on the mechanics of that word. The government has created an institution whose sole job is to watch over sealed toxic waste forever.
Forever.
The private corporations that operated the mills sold the uranium to the government, extracted their profits, distributed dividends to their shareholders, and then dissolved or moved on.
Yep.
The environmental cost, however, was transformed into a permanent public obligation. Taxpayers in the year 2100 will still be funding the Office of Legacy Management to ensure a clay barrier in Tuba City hasn't eroded. It is the ultimate socialization of private risk.
That is the perpetual care model in action. The profit is privatized, the waste is socialized.
Right.
Now, UMTRCA dealt with the physical dirt. The second piece of the legal scaffolding attempted to deal with the human bodies. That brings us to ReCA.
The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act passed in 1990.
Yes. ReCA is significant because it represents the closest the federal government has ever come to formally acknowledging the human toll of the domestic nuclear weapons program.
Okay.
The act created an administrative program managed by the Department of Justice to provide a fixed, one-time financial payment to specific categories of people whose health was destroyed by the industry.
So the miners.
Right, the underground uranium miners, the mill workers, the ore transporters, and the downwinders. Those are civilians who live downwind of the atmospheric nuclear testing in Nevada.
But looking closely at the statutory language, ReCA is very specifically designed as a compensation scheme.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a legal admission of fault or liability by the United States government. And the bureaucracy of claiming that compensation is notoriously brutal.
The burden of proof placed on the victims was, and remains, immense. To receive compensation, a former miner had to prove two things. First, that they worked in a specifically designated uranium mine during a very specific window of time. And second, that they developed a specifically listed compensable disease, such as a primary cancer of the lung or severe pneumoconiosis.
Which sounds straightforward until you look at the reality of how these men worked. I mean, how do you prove you worked in a dog hole mine in 1956 when the mining operation consisted of 3 guys with a truck who paid you in cash and then dissolved the company entirely in 1962?
Exactly. There are no W-2s. There are no corporate HR departments to call.
So they just couldn't prove it.
That evidentiary hurdle disqualified countless individuals. Furthermore, the list of compensable diseases was rigidly defined. If a miner developed a severe, debilitating respiratory illness that didn't perfectly match the statutory definition in RE, their claim was denied.
That's devastating.
And even if you could gather the employment records and the medical diagnoses, which often required travel to specialists far off the reservation, the actual compensation was a fixed lump sum, typically $100,000 for a miner.
$100,000 for a terminal lung cancer diagnosis that robbed a family of their primary earner decades ago. And the fragility of this program has been on full display recently. ReCA was built with a sunset clause. It wasn't designed to last forever.
No, and the timeline of that sunset clause created a massive crisis.
Huh.
In June of 2024, the authorization for ReCA completely lapsed.
It just stopped.
The Department of Justice literally stopped accepting new claims.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that lapse. Because radiation exposure has a latency period of decades, people are still being diagnosed today.
Exactly.
If an elderly Navajo man who worked in the mills in the 1960s finally received a terminal lung cancer diagnosis in August of 2024, he was met with a closed door. The federal government essentially said, the window for justice has expired.
It was a period of extreme administrative limbo and deep anxiety for these communities. The lobbying effort to revive the program was intense.
I can imagine.
Finally, a year later, on July 4, 2025, ReCA was reauthorized as a rider attached to a larger federal budget package. The reauthorization revived the program and extended it through December 31st, 2028.
Okay, so it's back for now.
Yes, and it also expanded the geographical boundaries, notably covering downwinders in the entire state of New Mexico, and slightly broadened the disease eligibility.
But the underlying structure remains. It is a temporary program. As we sit here in 2026, the clock is rapidly ticking down to 2028.
It is.
It is a temporary bureaucratic bandage applied to a permanent intergenerational wound. Which brings us to the third and final framework of the legal maze. MTRCA handled the mills, ReCA handled the sick workers. What handles the actual holes in the ground, the dog hole mines themselves?
The cleanup of the abandoned mine sites falls under the jurisdiction of CERCLO, which is universally known as the Superfund law.
Right, Superfund.
Unlike UMTRCA, which socializes the cost, the entire philosophy of Superfund is the polluter pays. It is based on a legal mechanism called joint and several liability. The EPA identifies a contaminated site, investigates its history, and tries to identify the potentially responsible parties, or PRPs.
The PRPs are the corporate entities that created the mess. If the EPA can find them, they can legally compel them to either clean up the site themselves or reimburse the federal government for the cost of the cleanup. And we actually have a massive recent example of this mechanism functioning as intended right back at Church Rock.
We do. The United Nuclear Corporation Church Rock site, where the dam failed, was placed on the Superfund National Priorities List in 1983.
Okay.
Fast forward through decades of litigation, corporate restructuring, and remedial investigations to April 2024. The EPA and the DOJ finalized a major consent decree with United Nuclear Corporation and its corporate successor in liability, General Electric.
The mechanics of corporate succession are important here. General Electric acquired UNC, and under Superfund law, when you buy a company, you buy its environmental liabilities.
Correct.
GE cannot simply disavow the Church Rock spill.
Precisely. Under the 2024 consent decree, GE agreed to a settlement valued at approximately $63 million. The decree legally mandates GE to excavate roughly 1 million cubic yards of heavily contaminated mine waste from the Northeast Church Rock mine site.
And put it where?
They have to transport it and permanently dispose of it at the adjacent engineered mill site.
$63 million is a massive sum, and moving 1 million cubic yards of earth is a monumental engineering task. But let's look at the timeline.
Yeah.
The spill happened in 1979, the site was listed in 1983, the consent decree was signed in 2024, and the physical excavation of that material is projected to take well over a decade to complete.
The timeline of justice is glacial. It will likely be 60 years between the original contamination event and the final stabilization of the site.
60 years.
And here is the truly terrifying reality. The GE settlement is the absolute best-case scenario. It is the exception.
Because GE is a massive corporation.
Exactly. The Superfund mechanism only works if there is a massive, highly solvent, continuously operating corporate entity left to sue.
Which brings us to the void, because if we look at the 2014 Government Accountability Office report, GAO 14323, the scope of the problem is staggering. The federal agencies identified 523 abandoned uranium mines on or immediately adjacent to the Navajo Nation.
523 individual sites of unmitigated contamination. And for the vast majority of those sites, there is no General Electric waiting at the end of the legal maze.
Walk me through the legal loophole. How does a corporation just disappear when the EPA comes knocking?
It is the brutal reality of corporate law interacting with environmental latency. The dog hole mines were often operated by small regional companies. They incorporated, leased the land, dug the ore, sold it to the AEC, and when the market cooled off in the 1960s, they declared bankruptcy or simply dissolved the corporate entity entirely.
They just closed up shop.
Yeah, and when a corporation legally dissolves, its assets are liquidated, and the entity ceases to exist. 40 years later, when the EPA tries to find a PRP to fund a multi-million-dollar cleanup, they're looking at a phantom.
The company's gone.
The company's gone. The owners are deceased. The corporate veil protects the individuals, and the liability becomes what they call an orphan share.
An orphan share, meaning no one is legally responsible.
The jurisdiction collapses. The Navajo Nation EPA lacks the vast budgetary resources and the specific jurisdictional authority over certain federal lands or private actors to force a cleanup.
Right.
And the federal EPA is constrained by complex national priority lists and limited congressional funding for orphan sites. The result is administrative paralysis. Federal agencies conduct endless audits documenting the lack of progress, while the physical waste remains exactly where it was dumped in 1958.
So the legal maze essentially functions as a shield, allowing the liability to evaporate into history.
That's exactly how it functions.
It is a breathtakingly efficient system for externalizing costs. And as we pivot to the second half of our dossier, we see that this exact same structural logic, the extraction of wealth, the socialization of environmental costs, and the reliance on legal mazes, it wasn't confined to the Cold War nuclear program.
No, not at all.
It was replicated perfectly by the fossil fuel industry. We are moving from the uranium boom to the coal boom.
The transition from nuclear materials to fossil fuels changes the nature of the environmental impact, but the underlying power dynamics remain identical.
Right.
While the uranium boom left behind toxic waste, the coal boom on the Colorado Plateau took something irreplaceable away. We have to look at the Black Mesa complex.
Black Mesa is a massive elevated plateau shared by the Hopi tribe and the Navajo Nation. And the story of extraction here centers around a piece of infrastructure designed to extract an astonishing amount of water.
Yes.
Let's set the physical scene. Operating on Black Mesa was Peabody Coal, which later became Peabody Energy. They operated two massive surface strip mines, the Kayenta mine and the Black Mesa mine.
And the scale of earth moving at these surface mines was monumental. But the Black Mesa mine is historically unique because of how it transported its coal.
They didn't just load it onto trains.
No, they didn't build a railroad. They didn't rely on fleets of trucks. They built a 273-mile-long coal slurry pipeline.
A slurry pipeline. The mechanics of this are fascinating and inherently destructive.
Yeah.
Because you cannot pump dry, solid rocks through a pipe.
Right. To move coal this way, Peabody had to build a facility to pulverize the coal into a fine dust. Then they had to mix that coal dust with an enormous volume of water to create a sludge, the slurry.
Exactly.
Once you have a fluid sludge, you use massive pumping stations to push it 273 miles across the desert landscape.
And the destination for this slurry was the Mojave Generating Station, a massive multi-megawatt coal-fired power plant located in Laughlin, Nevada, right at the very southern tip of the state.
So the geography of the extraction is clear. We were taking coal from Hopi and Navajo land, pumping it across the desert to Nevada, burning it to boil water and spin turbines, all to generate the electricity required to power the air conditioners and bright lights of distant, booming metropolises like Las Vegas and Los Angeles.
Yeah, a direct pipeline from the reservation to the city.
It is a direct pipeline transferring energy,
Yeah.
but the fundamental engineering question is, where did Peabody Coal get the immense volume of water required to mix millions of tons of coal slurry? Well, in one of the most arid regions of North America, you cannot rely on surface water. Peabody tapped into the Navajo aquifer, commonly referred to as the N aquifer.
The N aquifer.
Yeah, and the geology of the N aquifer is crucial to understanding the conflict. This is a deep, confined groundwater system housed in ancient Navajo sandstone beneath Black Mesa. Because it is confined aquifer in a desert environment, its recharge rate is microscopic.
Let's explain that recharge rate. This isn't an underground river fed by rushing streams.
Exactly, no. The water enters the aquifer primarily through snowmelt, slowly percolating through porous rock outcrops over thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
Carbon-14 dating of the water deep within the aquifer reveals that it is ancient. It fell as rain during the last ice age. It is a finite, essentially non-renewable resource on any human timescale.
I want to use an analogy to ground this. Think of the N aquifer as a massive generational savings account. Because of the desert environment, the interest it earns, the recharge rate from snowmelt, is just pennies a year.
Perfect analogy.
For centuries, the Hopi and Navajo communities survived by carefully withdrawing only the pennies of interest through natural springs and shallow wells. Then the industrial slurry pipeline arrives, and it begins withdrawing millions of dollars from the principal balance every single day.
That is an incredibly accurate mechanical description. For decades, Peabody pumped over 1 billion gallons of pristine, ancient drinking water out of the aquifer every year.
1 billion gallons a year.
Mixed it with coal dust and shot it to Nevada. They were literally pumping the lifeblood of the desert dry to provide cheap electricity to a different state.
And the impacts of this massive drawdown became the subject of one of the most intense environmental disputes in the Southwest.
They did. Local tribal members, environmental advocates, independent hydrologists, they all began meticulously documenting the collapse of the local hydrology.
What were they seeing?
Ancient natural springs that had sustained Hopi villages for centuries began to run dry. Shallow wells utilized by Navajo ranchers failed. The water table beneath Black Mesa was demonstrably dropping, and the communities attributed this directly to Peabody's massive industrial pumping.
Now, the federal documentation requires us to impartially report the contours of this dispute.
Right.
Peabody Coal, backed by certain engineering reports and some federal agency analyses, aggressively pushed back on that causality.
Yes, they did.
They argued that the decline in the water table and the drying of the springs were primarily driven by a severe, prolonged regional drought affecting the entire Southwest, combined with the gradual increase in local municipal water use. They maintained that the deep industrial pumping in the confined aquifer was not the primary driver of the shallow spring failures.
And the specific drop-by-drop causality of complex groundwater modeling was heavily contested in courtrooms and agency hearings for years. However, the underlying structural reality of the arrangement was undeniable.
Which was?
An irreplaceable, exceedingly slow recharging water source was being continuously depleted on a massive scale, and that water was leaving the reservation entirely. The environmental cost was borne locally. The economic benefit of the power generated was realized hundreds of miles away.
But I have to play devil's advocate here, because Peabody didn't just show up and stick a pipe in the ground illegally.
No.
The Hopi tribe and the Navajo Nation signed the leases in the 1960s. They agreed to sell the water and the coal. Doesn't that negate the idea of a structural externality? They were compensated.
To understand those lease agreements, you have to look at the historical context of the negotiations, which is basically a textbook example of unequal bargaining power.
Okay, take me back to the 1960s.
In the 1960s, the tribal councils were under immense pressure from the federal government to develop their resources. Furthermore, the federal government, specifically the Department of the Interior, acted as the trustee for the tribes in these negotiations.
So the government is supposed to be looking out for them.
Supposed to, yes. But decades later, investigations revealed severe conflicts of interest, where federal attorneys and politically connected lawyers heavily pressured the tribal councils into signing leases that dramatically undervalued the coal and the water.
Wow.
They locked the tribes into terrible royalty rates for decades.
So the government, acting as their legal guardian, effectively negotiated a deal that served the energy interests of the broader Southwest far more than it served the economic interests of the tribes.
Yes. And as the decades passed, the tribes became structurally trapped by those exact leases. Because despite the low rates, the sheer volume of extraction meant that coal royalties eventually became the financial bedrock of the tribal governments.
Which brings us to the agonizing double bind of the closures. Just like the uranium era, the coal era eventually collapsed.
It did.
But the collapse wasn't a moment of pure triumph. In 2005, the Mojave generating station in Nevada was forced to shut down. The plant operators refused to invest the hundreds of millions of dollars required to install court-mandated scrubbers to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions.
And the closure of the power plant triggered an immediate infrastructure domino effect. Without a buyer to burn the coal, the slurry pipeline had no purpose and ceased operations.
Right.
Without the pipeline to move the coal, the Black Mesa mine could not function. It shut down at the end of 2005. The neighboring Kayenta mine, which supplied a different, closer power plant via a dedicated railroad, managed to hold on for another 14 years, but it too finally closed its doors in 2019.
Let's examine the economic crater left behind. The closure of the Mojave Station meant the slurry pipeline stopped. The massive daily drain on the N aquifer finally ceased.
Yes.
From an environmental and hydrological standpoint, this was the victory the communities had fought decades to achieve. The water was no longer leaving the mesa.
But the economic devastation was absolute.
Yeah.
Decades of heavy reliance on the mining industry meant that the Hopi and Navajo governments had few other massive revenue streams.
The money just dried up.
When the mines closed, the coal royalties vanished. The high-paying union jobs at the mines evaporated. For the Hopi tribe in particular, coal revenues had historically accounted for upwards of 80% of their entire operating budget.
80%. I mean, imagine the federal government or a state government losing 80% of its tax base overnight.
It's unfathomable.
The revenue that disappeared was the exact same money being used to fund tribal schools, maintain the roads, run the health clinics, provide basic social services. The end of the environmental devastation triggered an immediate, severe economic depression.
This is the ultimate tragic illustration of the structural trap. There was no costless choice available to these communities. To stop the destruction of their sacred, life-sustaining water supply, they had to willingly plunge their governments into near bankruptcy and put thousands of their own citizens out of work.
Yeah.
The fact that a community is forced to choose between having drinking water and having a functioning school system is the purest symptom of unequal bargaining power.
You sacrifice your water and your lungs for a paycheck. And when the extraction finally ceases, you get your aquifer back, though it's severely depleted, but the paycheck vanishes, leaving you stranded in an economic void.
Exactly.
This brings us out of the historical archives and directly into the present moment. We are recording this deep dive in the middle of 2026. The Cold War arms race is a chapter in a history book. The massive coal plants of the Southwest are being dismantled. But for the Hopi and Navajo communities, what remains? What is the reality on the ground today?
The reality in 2026 is a landscape defined by lingering, deeply unresolved crises. First, the physical waste remains.
Yeah.
Despite the millions spent by the EPA, the jurisdictional maze continues to function.
The orphan shares.
Yes, a vast number of those 523 identified abandoned uranium mines still await comprehensive remediation. The slow drip of heavy metals into the environment continues.
Then there's the biological timeline. The human body keeps a different clock than the corporate ledger. The latency period for radiation-induced illnesses is incredibly long.
It is.
People who played in the tailings piles as children, or who grew up in homes constructed with radioactive foundation stones, are still developing severe respiratory and renal diseases today. The health crisis is not a historical footnote. It is an active, ongoing trauma in the hospitals on the reservation.
And legally, the administrative battle is as frantic as ever. With the ReCA reauthorization set to hard sunset on December 31st, 2028, advocates and families are currently racing against a ticking clock.
They only have a couple of years left.
They are desperately trying to navigate the complex bureaucracy, locate decades-old medical records, and secure compensation before the federal government permanently shuts the window. There's a palpable, terrifying realization that the program will end while thousands of people are still suffering.
And environmentally, stopping the pumps on Black Mesa did not magically reset the desert. Because the N aquifer recharges at a rate of pennies a year, the billions of gallons that were pumped to Nevada have not been replaced.
No, they haven't.
The aquifer has not refilled. The springs that ran dry have not miraculously begun flowing again. The water was spent. It was turned into steam over Nevada, and it is gone forever.
The timescale of the harm is the most sobering element of the dossier. We are analyzing federal procurement decisions and corporate lease agreements made in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
Right.
Those decisions dictated the environmental and biological reality of these communities in 2026, and the half-life of the resulting waste guarantees they will continue to dictate that reality for generations to come.
I want you, the listener, to pause and absorb the sheer weight of that timescale. The uranium pulled from the dog hole mines fueled a nuclear arsenal that defined global geopolitics for half a century. The coal slurry pumped from Black Mesa built the sprawling, glittering desert metropolises of the American Southwest.
It did.
That era of unbridled extraction generated unimaginable wealth, security, and technological progress for the United States as a whole. But the cost of that prosperity was never evenly distributed. For the Diné and Hopi communities, the toll of the Cold War and the energy boom is actively present in their diminished aquifers, their entombed landscapes, and their lungs.
To synthesize the immense amount of material we've covered today, the dossier outlines three intertwined mechanisms of marginalization.
Okay.
First, the Cold War uranium boom, where a monopsony federal market incentivized deadly extraction while actively withholding the informed consent required for workers to protect themselves.
Right.
Second, the Church Rock disaster, which demonstrated how a massive release of radioactive waste into a civilian water supply can be effectively erased from national memory simply due to its geographic and political distance from media hubs.
And third, the Black Mesa coal operations, which utilized the legal apparatus of the federal trust responsibility to negotiate the systematic draining of an ancient, finite aquifer, ultimately forcing a choice between environmental preservation and total economic collapse.
Collectively, these historical facts demonstrate the core thesis: structural marginalization, the combination of legal mazes, lack of federal representation, and desperate economic need. It allows a powerful nation to socialize the immense environmental costs of its progress, ensuring the bill is paid by the most vulnerable.
And that leads directly to a final provocative thought that I want to leave you to mull over. We have spent this entire hour looking backward. We've meticulously examined how the mid-century energy grids and nuclear arsenals required the creation of permanent sacrifice zones far from the centers of political power. But right now, in 2026, we are standing at the precipice of another massive global industrial shift. We are aggressively building the infrastructure for the next great energy transition. We are opening massive new strip mines for lithium, copper, and rare earth elements to build the batteries and grids of the green economy.
And the global demand for these new critical minerals is accelerating at a pace that perfectly mirrors the uranium rush of the late 1940s.
Exactly.
The pressure to extract quickly and cheaply is immense.
Which means we must ask the critical question: as we celebrate the technological marvels of the 21st century and the greening of our power grid, who is currently lacking the political power to say no to the new extraction, whose backyards and whose water supplies are we quietly designating as the sacrifice zones of tomorrow? Because if we haven't fundamentally altered the structural legal architecture that allows corporations to dissolve and liabilities to vanish, we aren't actually solving the problem. We are just throwing another incredibly lavish party and planning, once again, to dump the toxic waste in someone else's living room for our descendants to deal with in 2080.
It's a sobering thought.
It really is. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous, vital deep dive. Understanding the unvarnished mechanics of how our history was built is the only way to ensure we do not blindly repeat it.